What do trans people, immigrants, communists, black people, and witches all have in common? No, this isn't some joke about a strange assortment of people entering a bar. It is a legitimate question, a rhetorical one, but not a joke regardless. Any takers? No? Okay, I give up. They're all victims of what we call the culture Kampf. Let's roll back 100 years or so, back to the reunification of Germany before World War I, specifically to the rule of Otto von Bismarck, top 10 most aura-maxed Patrick Bateman political figures in history, for the brain rotted amongst you. That is, he was essentially able to transform what is now modern Germany from a handful of separated states into one by expanding the influence of Prussia across the other states. Bismarck's successes have been accredited to his establishment of the Realpolitik strategy, which utilized ideological and moral compromises to expand an individual's or nation's power through forming various alliances and rivalries. However, there was a secondary strategy which is arguably just as influential to the modern political environment: the culture Kampf, or as we know it today, the culture war. Often we see it as this nebulous term utilized to compartmentalize identity politics and policy discussion into battlefields between various shades of neoliberal geriatrics. However, to put it into exact terms, the culture Kampf is a conflict between civil governments and religious authorities, especially over control of education and church appointments, or more broadly, a conflict between cultures or value systems. The first of those definitions is more specific to Bismarck's time, as this perceived war of the culture was waged between the Prussian state and Catholic Church. While the intricacies of the state's accusations against the church aren't entirely relevant to our discussion, what is incredibly pertinent is the impact and purpose of this ideological conflict. Let's return to Realpolitik. To simplify, it means to be ideologically bankrupt in order to get stuff done. That might be a little uncharitable, but you get my point. Bismarck wasn't the type of guy to fret over various ideological and moral qualms. For example, Bismarck himself had grown up as part of the Prussian landowning nobility and held reactionary views in relation towards the rise of the modern bourgeois industrial elite of the late 19th and early 20th century. However, he compromised and gave in and supported mass industrialization in order to empower Prussia as the dominant economic force amongst the fractured German states. Similarly, Bismarck viewed the conflict with the Catholic Church as a means of creating a common enemy and uniting the once separated peoples of the various states under Prussian nationalism. To bring this into a more modern context, let's look at what I believe is one of the most important books for us to read in this age of media saturation and lack of media literacy: Manufacturing Consent by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. To condense the blurb into a sentence, it's about how our media is influenced and how it then influences us into consenting to the actions of our state domestically and often more horrifically abroad. How does this link to the culture war though? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But for now, I'm gonna nerd out to you just a little bit, as if I haven't done that enough so far. The book breaks down the filtering of what the media shows us into 5 different levels. The first is ownership. Mass media is often owned by conglomerate companies with varying financial incentives influencing the output of the media firm. Second is advertising. In order to stay afloat, the media requires advertising, meaning that we as viewers have to be kept engaged for as long a period as possible, and the network must promote materialism to some extent. Third is the media elite. The scope of those with access to information on certain topics, most often foreign policy, are primarily within the government. Thus, biased, uncritical, and false information is given from hand-selected sources agreeable to the agenda of the state. Fourth is flak, a mechanism of response in which the media dogpiles a certain story, individual, or group that presents a conflicting narrative to the mainstream perspective. Then finally, and most relevant to the culture war, is the common enemy. See what I did there? Linking the terminology from the book into the culture Kampf stuff and coming back to it. Okay, you don't care. Whatever. This level of the common enemy refers to a faction, group, nation, whatever, that the media and political establishment frames as a unifying threat. In the Cold War, whilst the Democrats and Republicans both attempted to maintain control, there was a uniparty acceptance that the USSR was this common enemy, or more broadly, communists were, which manifested in a number of anxiety-ridden shams. My favourite of which being the KGB plot to kill the Pope. I won't go too deep into it, the book has a whole chapter on it anyways. But essentially, some right-wing Turkish nationalists tried to kill the Pope, and the Western media framed this as a Turkish KGB asset attempting an assassination because the Soviets wanted to destabilize the West's theological bastion of the Catholic Church and also just hated Jesus and religion because of communism. Some sources have even suggested that Italian Secret Service agents offered the assassin a reduced sentence if he would have claimed that there was a KGB Bulgarian connection. Weirdly enough, however, the guy denied this and declared he was Jesus. This is just a crazy tangent, but I thought I'd share the story because it's just so strange and surprisingly relevant to our conversation on media framing of this common enemy. Getting back on track, however, let's talk about witches. Okay, I apologize in both advance and retrospect for all the tangents I have taken and will continue to take in this video. So we were studying Macbeth in English last term, and I came upon a crazy realization when exposed to the fact that in times of political instability in Renaissance England, they would hold witch trials. See where I'm going with this? Even back in the 1600s, culture kampf was utilised by even the British to maintain feudal control over the growingly unsatisfied serfdom with the rise of Renaissance humanism, the printing press, and diversification of Protestant sects, threatening the monopolistic ideological hegemony of the monarchy. Macbeth, as a piece of media from this time period, then utilizes witches to represent that which disrupts the natural order and then causes death and despair, shifting the blame from the system and hierarchy, causing poor well-being outcomes for the vast majority of British subjects to some isolated Satanist bag ladies living on the outskirts of town. Because they were a small minority of powerless, isolated, and admittedly seemingly strange people, so-called witches made the perfect scapegoat for anything going wrong. You know where else things go wrong a lot? The US. Now it's time for the obligatory America Bad segment. Well, technically we did that before with the Cold War stuff, but whatever. Whilst it is trite and a bit hypocritical to point out America as the center of bigotry and whatnot, it just makes such an easy case study because everyone has a baseline knowledge of what's happening there, whether we like it or not. Also, because of the Democrats' incompetence, we can also observe the unrestricted conservative trends of the oncoming mid-2020s. So, let's talk about illegal immigrants. The clear bipartisan boogeyman of this election, immigrants were painted by both sides of the establishment as criminals, dangerous, greedy, unhelpful, etc. Whilst the more intense hatred was spouted by the Republicans as usual, the Democrats joined in on the fun this time by advocating for a wall. I'm not joking. If only 2016 could see us now. Obviously, these claims are false. Illegal immigrants commit less crime per capita than natural-born US citizens, are the backbone of the agricultural and food processing industries, and don't even have the paperwork to cash in on the majority of the US's lackluster welfare system, yet still pay taxes. Despite the blatant falsehood of these claims, undocumented immigrants, or illegal aliens, were a key issue in this election cycle, which was won through a promise to deport 20 million people, the vast majority of which are only guilty of the crime of seeking a better life for themselves and their family. But what if I told you that this has actually been happening for over 100 years in the US? Would you be surprised? Oh, of course not. The chronology of the video is so messed up. Anyways, East Louis, 1917. White factory workers organize and strike against their bosses, making up the vast majority of the workforce, despite a significant number of black people who had migrated from the South, excluded from working due to essentially racism. However, these black workers were given the opportunity to work once these strikes took place in the stead of their white counterparts, who they were paid significantly less than. Now, what should these white workers do? organize with the black workers to form a combined union and attain higher pay for the city's working class people, or B, burn down the black neighborhood. Considering the pattern of the video, you can assume what choice they made. Because the white workers perceived the black workers as taking their jobs, they misdirected their anger at victims of somewhat similar oppression, underpaid workers. Despite both being victims of the capital-owning class, the blame was easily shifted onto a foreign, disempowered, and from the white workers' racist perspective, a seemingly strange minority group. In the lead up to and following the election, we have seen a number of honestly adept comparisons between Donald Trump and Hitler. And now I'm going to make just another blatantly obvious comparison. Immigrants and Jewish people. Do I even have to explain? I probably do, because we never seem to learn from history. Whilst we aren't at any sort of Holocaust yet, the Nazi regime slowly consolidated control and pushed against Jewish people incrementally, bit by bit. First, they couldn't work in the government. Then, they're no longer citizens. Then they get deported. And finally, the solution to the so-called Jewish problem. Currently, we're on our way to the deportation stage, and it will likely end there as the US has no goals to expand its borders, right? But then, if the rhetoric escalates, as the political climate continues to destabilize due to decreasing standards of living, they might need to blame someone else. Legal immigrants, trans people, black people, who knows? It could be whatever demographic you're from next. Unless you're a white, cis, straight male. No shade to you guys though. Love, all love. Damn. I ruined the tone of the ending. I can salvage it with that reflection from that pastor in Nazi Germany. First They Came, by Pastor Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists. I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.